And Danie, as you have so eloquently written in your contribution now about retraining the mind and how to discover new erotic zones and explore and how important it is. Just prior to the session, we had Joy Duffield who explained to us the importance of touch in a relationship, and be it with someone that is sexually active or someone that is in a relationship or not in a relationship. It's very important. So would you give us an introduction as to the article that you've written?
Sure. So the biggest part of the article was about how our brain is actually quite fluid, and that even with a serious injury like a spinal cord injury, there's a lot that we can still do. I think it's easy to feel like life is over and so much has changed, but there's actually a lot of adaptations that our mind can make. It's a wonderful organ that we have to our disposal. So yeah, I think the more knowledge you have on it, the better you can utilize it to still have a fulfilling sex life and still experience wonderful intimacy with your partner.
Well, yes, and especially the changes that one goes through when you have acquired a spinal cord injury, where you were used to the traditional method, shall I call it, and now you have to make, or now you have to become used to the I won't call it the new normal as we do with COVID-19, but the new life that you live, the new body that you have. So, and you mentioned that the brain, according to your article, is that the brain is the most important sex organ for that matter. Mm. But to tell me, how does the brain make the connections with the various sensations?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. The brain is definitely the most important sex organ, and probably the most underrated and less often used than it should. So I think the basics of it is that any sensation that you experience on your body is then sent via the spinal cord to the brain and communicated via synapses, which is just basically small pathways between the neurons in the different areas of the brain. So whenever you experience something physical, it's transported all that way, and in that part of the brain, it's registered and interpreted, and often then coupled with an emotional response to it. So a sexual encounter, as an example, there's a physical sensation attached to it, and that's communicated via a spinal cord all the way to the brain, and then attached to an emotional reaction. So there's elation or joy or enjoyment or any of those types of feelings. And because we enjoy it so much, it's something that you want to experience again. So the pathways that message travels gets strengthened, much like an electrical cord would. The electricity always travels via the route of least resistance, and it's the same with our brains. If you do the same thing repeatedly, that's where the most comfortable for the brain to go, and the easiest for the brain to interpret. So that's why when a spinal cord injury happens, that pathway is blocked. So the communication from a certain area of your body below the level of injury, the message is still being sent, but it's not received by the brain. So therefore, there's a disconnect. And in the same way, from the brain to the rest of your body, that communication doesn't come through clearly, and that's often that is what the difficulty is with spinal cord injuries and sexuality, is that the experience is different. If it's a complete injury, there's often no sensation, which obviously then changes the sexual experience completely.
Okay, I think we just lost.
Yeah, sorry, I was lost a little bit, Mariska, but just allow me to make the comment while we have the connection here. Thank you, Danie. Sorry, you touch on important matters there, as you mentioned now. But now, how does one then retrain the brain?
So the way that I'd like to maybe just describe the process is it's very similar to when you're driving with your car on a dirt road. If there's a road that's been traveled many times, it's relatively easy to travel on that road, relatively. It goes really fluid. But if you start driving next to the road on the grass patch, as an example, where there's no road, there's a lot of resistance there. However, if you continue to drive there, after a while, that will become the path. That will become the road of least resistance, and in time, the initial road also then goes up again. And our brain has this wonderful ability called neural plasticity, and that is exactly what happens. The new path, the new way of communicating, becomes the new normal. If I can use your COVID reference, that becomes the more preferred method of communication. Your brain gets used to that. So if you think of a spinal cord injury as an example, now that there might not be the same messages coming through as there would have before, I often encourage the patients to look for other areas that where you do have sensation. Often just above the level of injury, there's an increase in sensation, sometimes in the neck or the ears. All of that often has a heightened sensitivity to touch. And the idea is to rewire how your brain understands the sexual messages that come through. So in essence, what you want to do is to connect that sexual message to a different area of your brain. So it's about rediscovering your body and connecting different parts. So as if you maybe your partner maybe kisses you on your neck, and that in the context of intimacy, and you're quite sure where this is heading, the brain interprets that as being part of the sexual experience. And after a while doing that, the brain gets what you're trying to communicate, and it replaces the old way of experiencing sexual relationships, sexual experiences. Unfortunately, just like the analogy that I used about the road, it takes time. And that's, I think, is often where a lot of frustration lies. Initially it doesn't feel right, it feels awkward, and it's about rediscovering your body, much like a teenager would, when hormones kick in for the first time. You rediscover parts of you that you're not used to, and it feels a bit awkward. But when you push through and when you try out different things and see what works for you, after a while that starts to feel normal, and the old way of doing it almost feels abnormal. And literally physically in our brain, it is rewired. The synapses physically grow stronger and make new connections. So even on a physiological level, that change happens, not just emotionally. It's not positive thinking or anything like that. It physically changes, and it's strengthened when it's coupled with an intense emotion like sexual encounters.
Oh, thank you very much. And then this is a follow-up question then. So if someone is struggling to retrain the brain, are there other ways to make intimacy more enjoyable?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that initially it will always be a struggle. Like the analogy that I used with the road, the first time you drive on the grass next to the road, it's not comfortable. It doesn't feel normal, and so I think just to normalize that experience as well, that initially it will always be a struggle, and it's frustrating and it's difficult. I usually suggest to think of intimacy as a journey rather than focusing on the destination. We so often want, especially as men, unfortunately, want to get to the climax. You want to get to the actual sex, and the emotional part of the build-up to it is often neglected. I know I'm generalizing a lot, and it's not the same for everyone, but we often find that with males, the physical part is a bigger focus than the emotional part. And my suggestion is always to focus on the emotional part first. Try to strengthen that, because that increases the experience of the sexual encounter. That's the part where the intimacy comes in, and the physical enjoyment of it follows that. If the focus is on the physical enjoyment, often the emotional part gets neglected. With that frustration, the physical experience is also not the same. So it's a bit of a paradox. When you focus on the emotional part, the physical part is more enjoyable. But when you focus solely on the physical part, it's often disappointing, and then obviously leads to frustration and distance between you and your partner. So I generally suggest that anyway, regardless if you have a spinal cord injury or not. I think it's the emotional part, the intimacy, the build up to it, romantic part of it is very underrated in my opinion. And the people who do take that on and make much more effort with that tend to be much more successful in this rewiring process and getting to that. It's really about the journey.
Oh, wow. That really is valuable information there. And interestingly that you mentioned from the male perspective. And I just want to use, and I'm not the expert and on the subject, and also I am not the expert when it comes to quoting stats, especially the amount of spinal cord injured. But there is a large portion of young men, because of the activities that we participate in, that finds themselves spinal cord injured. Much more men than males and females. And it's young in a certain age. And if I should make it personally, when I described it 20 years ago, I said, I was in the flare of my youth. I was at that point in my life where I was reaching my peak. To say I was young and fit and so on. And then to have had a spinal cord injury, and obviously the sexual function was also one of the factors that was now affected. So with that in mind, what advice would you give? Because we do peer counseling and we see how devastated young males are out there when they realize that the sexual function or capabilities or abilities has been affected. So what advice would you have for someone in that situation?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The stats do show that much more young males are affected than, especially with traumatic injuries, partly because of the work that we do. I think sometimes men tend to do more stupid things than women. We're much more risk-taking and things like car accidents and so on. So unfortunately, males are much more prone to spinal cord injuries. I think the important part is to firstly talk about it. You know, I think especially when it comes to sexuality, you mentioned earlier as well that it's often a topic that we don't talk about. It's very personal and very intimate. And I always we work in physical rehab, so we often encourage them to speak openly about it in the right context. You know, so in order to actually get some input, we need to talk about it, and I feel like that's probably the most important part to understanding sexual function and finding out what options are available and what can be done, and really getting to know your own body is the communication part. Asking for assistance, sharing your experiences, the things that affect you and physically and interpersonally. I think communication is key. It's the core of it. And when you think about it, sex is really, in essence, also just communication. It's a physical expression of intimacy, of love and closeness and attraction. So for me, it all comes back to communication every time. And it's a difficult situation to try to encourage people to talk about it when you've never been used to talking about it. But it is sad to see that the people in the flare of their life, like you mentioned, might be unsatisfied sexually and not really have fulfilling sexual relationships just because of a lack of information, because the conversation might be uncomfortable, or you don't know where to get the information that you're looking for. All of those things really stop you from living life to the fullest on a sexual level as well, not just physically or on other levels.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that insight into that topic and into the question. Yes. And so I do see that we have some questions there. We'll get to that now. I just want to ask, what would you say are some of the most important factors to a happy and healthy sex life? But that's both for people that is in or not in the relationship.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, communication I always put first. So firstly, for you personally to get the right information, to have those communication, those discussions, I think is important. But also then communication with your partner, to explore what you enjoy, what you don't enjoy, to actually discuss that, because I think it's in that discussion, in that discovery that you can really get to know your own body, and also for your partner to understand what do you enjoy and what not, because for them it's also new. if you've been in that relationship with a person before you had the injury. So I always say communication is paramount. I think the next part of it is that sex can easily become very serious in the sense that you overthink it. Something that might have come quite naturally, and it's just the way that your body functions now different. And so we overthink it. We spend a lot of time understanding and pulling it apart and thinking about it too much. And I think I often encourage the patients that I see to be more playful with it, to be to try out different things and to enjoy it. The ultimate goal of sex is not to do it perfectly or to be the best or anything like that. It's all about the enjoyment, the journey of it. So I often encourage people to be more creative, be more playful. I think sex is in essence just adult play. You know, it's about rediscovering what you enjoy, rediscovering your partner, and when you take that pressure off, the overthinking of it, and let it just happen and let your body guide you on what you enjoy. I think that already makes a big difference in how you view sex and how you approach it, with a lot more pressure. And then I would also add probably self-knowledge. I think knowing what you enjoy. So I think there's a period that you have to figure out, like I mentioned earlier, how does your body react now to different stimuli? You know, what happens when your partner does this, or what happens when your partner does that? And in that sense, the more you know about your body, the more you understand it yourself, the better you can communicate that, the better you can say, but I enjoy this, or I want to try that. It's so easy to get stuck in a rut and try the same thing again and again. And I think that monotony is really the killer of passion, you know. And so I often encourage them to also just try to understand your own body as well.
Danie, you give such a good advice and insights into the questions that we have. I will share some of the questions that we have on the chat with you also. And the first one is, and that is from Susie, and it's with regards to the level of injury. What if you are a complete injury from T3 versus incomplete? That is regarding the rewiring, as you mentioned, and the neuroplasticity, and being able to adapt if you are complete.
Yeah, so I think the question lies on two levels. The one is the level itself, and so if it's a complete injury, that's much more predictable and much more easy to understand, because it presents similarly for similar injuries. When it's an incomplete injury, that becomes a lot more difficult to give a blanket statement like this is how it will always be. So with an incomplete injury, it would really depend on how much damage there is, how much of the spinal cord has been injured. So I think that's the one side. But on the other level, the neuroplasticity that I referred to is something that happens in the brain. So within the synapses, it's not something that happens in the spinal cord. I know that there's a lot of technology attempting to repair parts of the spinal cord, and we're not there yet. And so the neuroplasticity doesn't refer to the rewiring of the spinal cord, because the spinal cord focuses more on the transport between the different parts of your body and the brain. In the brain, it's about the interpretation and the connection that it makes with the emotional side of it. And in that sense, you can have other inputs to the brain, and that is understood differently. So in other words, if somebody touches me in my neck, there's no sexual connotation there for me. But when I communicate to my partner that my neck is quite sensitive, and when you touch me there, and the setting, it's a romantic setting, it's just us, and the context is that of an intimate relationship, my brain says, but this elation that I'm feeling, this positive feelings that I'm feeling, it's connected to this physical sensation that I might be feeling in my neck. So it starts to rewire, but this is not just somebody accidentally touching me in my neck, like it often happens in the queues in the supermarket, you know, when somebody's really standing close to you. This is a different message that's coming in. And in that sense, your brain starts to learn that in this specific context, with this person in this way, that communicates something else. So it's the rewiring really has to do with the interpretation of the input that your brain is getting.
Okay, okay, yes. There is a follow-up question there also. And can fantasies or daydreaming, can that assist with the retraining of the brain? And then also, what role does imagination play?
That's a brilliant question. I think imagination is probably one of the biggest parts of it, because it's how we think about it that gives our brain that signal, what it attaches to. So I'm sure all of you who are sexually active have experienced that when you're in an intimate relationship or in an intimate situation and you're thinking about the work that I still need to do, or this is a meeting that I had today that didn't go well, the experience is not as enjoyable as it is when you're really in the moment, when you're really mindfully participating in it. So the real work for neuroplasticity really happens with daydreaming and imagination. So in the moment, in that context, being mindful and being present and really enjoying it, focusing on the sensations that you experience is vitally important. And I often also, with regards to daydreaming, I suggest to my patients that it helps to have a build-up to the sexual encounter. So throughout the day, whether it is messaging your partner, telling them how much you're looking forward to it or what it's going to be like, it really sets your brain up. It creates that anticipation for what's to come. And all of those connotations that you make on an emotional level really heightens the experience and strengthens those connections that your brain then forms in the interpretation of it. So daydreaming and using creativity, being mindful in the moment is probably the most important part when it comes to neuroplasticity.
Oh, thank you, thank you. And Danie, you mentioned 3 words that I took there, that you said: heightened, also, and then also, yes, and but in the moment, that is the 3 words that you mentioned out there, in the moment. And as experience, because I will say I was 29 years old, happily married, 5 kids, in the flare of my youth, and then faced with spinal cord injury, which one of the, and I call it one of the symptoms is erectile dysfunction.
Absolutely.
Yes, and as you mentioned there, in the moment you want to be spontaneous, but now you rely on medication, not only to set the mood, but to give you the ability to perform.
Yes.
So the question is, what is the most effective erectile dysfunction medication?
So, how much time do you have? So I want to actually connect what you just mentioned. I think it's so vitally important because since we're talking about spinal cord injuries now, it's easy to say that because of the injury, there might be erectile dysfunction. But what you mentioned is so important, that when we're mindlessly in the activity of a sexual encounter, regardless if you have a spinal cord injury or not, often erectile dysfunction is something that follows. That's why something like stress, as an example, it's said to cause erectile dysfunction. But when you think about it, stress is really being mindless in the moment, thinking about other things, worrying about other things. And so we can see it even in somebody that didn't have a spinal cord injury, that there's often erectile dysfunction exactly because of that reason, that you're not in the moment. So that's not unique to a spinal cord injury. With a spinal cord injury, the erectile dysfunction is often a sensation problem. Like I mentioned, the messages might not get through from the brain to your penis to be able to get an erection. So it's not just a spinal cord injury, just as a side note. In terms of interventions for erectile dysfunction, there are many avenues that we can go into. And you asked specifically about medication, which is one of them. But there are penile implants. That's one thing that I don't often suggest. I mean, there's injections that you can use that has a lot of side effects. There's the medication, as you mentioned, that can be administered in different ways. So with medication, I think the important thing is to note that most medication work in a similar fashion in that it increases blood flow. So if you're able to get part of an erection, or you're able to get an erection but it's not maintained long, the medication will help for that. But especially with complete injuries, they're often unable to get an erection at all. In the right context, there are different types of erections as well, which you can also get into if you like. But in the context of an intimate situation, if you're not able to get an erection at all, it sometimes happens that even the medication doesn't assist, because the medication doesn't cause the erection. And I mean, if you go through the list, I think there's hundreds and hundreds of different options, and it's also a difficult question to answer in the sense that that different medication will react to people differently. So I wouldn't say that there's one medication better than the other, but when medication is the preferred method of addressing erectile dysfunction, my advice is usually to try out different medications and see what works for you and what goes well. In conjunction with that, I most often suggest the vacuum pumps to help with that. VacuRect, as an example, is a brilliant product for that. And the reason why I suggest that is that it's not dependent on how your body will react to medication, as an example, because it's a physical thing that happens. It's not a biological reaction to medication. It's always effective, unless you're doing it wrong, unless you're not using the equipment properly. But because it's a mechanical way to assist with an erection, it's much more effective, and that's effective whether it's a complete injury, incomplete injury, even if it's erectile dysfunction that has nothing to do with the spinal cord injury. The process is the same because it's mechanical. So in my opinion, that's the more effective way of dealing with erectile dysfunction. But again, to each his own. You mentioned as well that it's part of the process of an intimate setting. So some people find that that's not, they're not comfortable doing that, and you're using the vacuum pump as an example. They prefer medication because it's not bringing anything else into it. So a lot of it is also dependent on personal preference. There's no one size fits all, but I think it helps to understand the variety of options available, and to find something that really works for you. But with the vacuum pump, it very often lessens the frustration, because if you don't find medication that works for you and you're on the 5th type of medication, you start to become despondent and nothing works. And to circumvent that, I usually prefer to suggest a method that you know will work, which is the vacuum pumps.
Well, thank you for that, because that was one of the questions that was posed, as we can see in the chats also. And so I'm not going to ask about the vacuum pump, because you have actually explained to us. And I would want to explore maybe about the cost of vacuum pump versus medication. But my question, and this is one of my last questions, I want to encourage free to ask them if they have any questions. My last question to you is, with the erectile dysfunction medication, or the medication in the house of any decent pharmacy, you'll find products there. So it's easy to buy yourself an erection, to put it as such. And in terms of, as I mentioned, young men, so you have achieved your inexperience, you've achieved your erection. What then? How do you manage that, or where to from there?
Yeah, so I missed a part of the question, so I'll answer the part that I heard, and if I skip a part, just ask again. So the part that I got is, now you found either medication or something that works for you, so you've got the erection. What now? So I think it's important to note that having an erection just gives you the ability to physically have sex. That does not mean that the sex will be enjoyable. Having an erection gives you the practical means to have penetrative sex, which is such a small part of sex, actually. And I know that it's really built up to be the most important part of sex, is to be able to physically have sex. But I think the reasoning around that is already setting you up for failure, because if you feel like the only obstacle is having an erection, it means that you're missing out on a big part, the emotional side of it. So just having an erection but no sensation will automatically make you compare the two. It will automatically make you say that, well, it's not the same as it was before. So if all your focus is just on having an erection, you're missing out on 90% of the experience of sex. And even though, depending on your level of injury and whether it's complete or not, you might be able to have an orgasm, or there's a lot of different experiences that you can have it's very likely going to be a different experience. And when your expectation is exactly the same as before, then you're bound to be disappointed. So I don't know if that answers the question. I think being able to have an erection is actually a very small part of it, even though we place a lot of emphasis on it.
It does actually answer the question, and also it ties in with what you have mentioned about the intimacy and then being a journey and not a destination.
Yeah, exactly.
So thank you very much for that. Yes. And allow me to open up and fire the floor for more questions. If there is anyone, give us an indication. There is, but you have answered some of the questions I have. I definitely have more questions. I do not want to hog the floor. And I know it's been a long day, and we can go. It's a very interesting topic. We can go on and on about it. Yes, but it is an important part of many relationships. And I've also in the 20 years that I have been a person with a spinal cord injury, I've seen also how relationships have crumbled because of that very topic. And sometimes it's a fact that there's no clear communication, or the expectations are maybe too high. And but I can see that you mentioned that communication is one of the most important aspects or success factors of any intimate relationship. Yeah. But thank you, Danie, for answering all the questions. And let me give you some concluding remarks before we have any other question from anyone else.
Yeah, so on what you mentioned just now, I think it's so important to mention that I agree that a lot of relationships crumble after a spinal cord injury. I always say a traumatic experience like that can either drive a wedge between two people, or it can bring them closer together. And unfortunately, if you just hope for the best, the tendency is for it to usually drive a wedge between the relationships. It does take hard work, and it takes commitment and an open mind and trying out different things. And then when people don't put in that effort, it is unfortunately often the case that relationships crumble. And I hope that the message gets out that there are people that can assist, both on an emotional level, on a physical level, on all of the questions that you might have. I can promise you not the only one. There are a lot of people who either have asked the same questions before, or have struggled with similar things, and the assistance is out there. You just have to reach out. Just another thing on what you mentioned earlier about the Vacurect pump. You can either just Google Vacurect and order directly from them. We also supply the pumps. It's about 1,800 Rand, if I remember correctly, for the pump, which I know is quite a lot of money to pay off, to pay out once off. But the upside to that is that you pay it only once. So it's a very durable product. It lasts very long. So unlike medication that you have to literally pay to have sex every time, if to be able to get an erection. So another reason why I suggest the vacuum devices is the fact that it's once you have it, then you can just continue to use it.
Well, Danie, thank you for putting it in that way. It's actually an investment, if you think of it.
Exactly.
If you think of it, yes, and especially as we mentioned earlier on about the young male newly spinal cord injured person to make. And as you mentioned now, 1,800 Rand for someone that is relying on a SASSA grant, disability grant. That's the whole grant. Once a month. But I'm just making that example now also that is also an big factor when it comes to sexuality and on the options that you have after sustaining a spinal cord injury.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to have another question, or read out the question. And it says, thank you. It's a very good comment that Susie makes there. The 5 Love Languages is still an excellent book to encourage intimacy through love languages. So I'm just making a note.
Yeah.
To see everyone that the 5 Love Languages is an excellent book.
Yes, I can really vouch for that. It's a very popular book as well, and in its core, it actually talks about communication. So how do you communicate your needs in a way that the other person can meet it? So speaking the same language as the person you are asking from, being aware of what your love language is and understanding what your partner's or the other person's is very, very helpful. It's a brilliant book.